and Seminole. They had written constitutions.
All right. And Judge Joe Brown walks us right into the next segment. If you can pull up the 1866 Choctaw and Chickasaw Indian Treaty, Chief Biko. And so what Judge Joe Brown just said is, well, not just we're just building Judge Joe Brown. So this is, we're just trying to help our people and educate our people. But his family was on the Trail of Tears, and now what we have up is the 1866 Indian Treaty. So Judge Joe Brown just mentioned 5 civilized tribes. These original people lived east of the Mississippi River. During the Indian Removal Act, which started in 1830, they created new governments west of the Mississippi River. But there are some flaws in what the United States government did by relocating these 5 tribes. I'm going to go on a limb, correct me if I'm wrong, Judge Brown. I believe they consolidated more tribes I believe they consolidated a lot of tribes into those 5 and pushed them into Indian territory. Is it safe for me to say that? Can I say that?
You're about right.
Okay. All right. So for those that are listening, keeping it simple, the original Cherokee were east of the Mississippi. They pushed them west, created a new government for the Cherokee and 4 other tribes: Choctaw, Chickasaw, Cherokee, Creek, and Seminole. Can you go to Article 3 of this treaty of the Choctaw and Chickasaw? And if you can go ahead and do a quick find for the word African. Now, what's interesting, Judge Joe Brown, is we have yet to find a government that comes out of the United States government's Congress with the word African. However, the first time we were able to see the word African is on the 1866 Indian Treaty. And we can see here that they were supposed to get 40 acres and a mule and $100 per person. I'm just going to read this real quick. It says, in trust for the said nations until the legislatures of the Choctaw and Chickasaw nations respectively shall have made such laws, rules, and regulations as may be necessary to give all persons of African descent resident in the said nation at the date of the Treaty of Fort Smith and their descendants hereto held in slavery among said nations. Stop right there. I don't want you to build on that yet, Judge Joe Brown. Let's go to Article 30 and quick find African, or go to your next African search on this document. I want you to get the full picture, Judge Joe Brown, before you build on it. So if we go to Article 30, we see the word African pops up again for the first time. And this isn't the United States government. This is the Choctaw and Chickasaw governments that we're seeing the word African pop up in. And the second time it pops up in 30, it basically describes the land occupancy for people of African descent. So it says the said persons of African descent mentioned in the 3rd article of the treaty shall make their selections as therein provided in the event of the making of laws, rules, and regulations aforesaid. After the expiration of 90 days from the date at which the Kansas Indians are to make their selections as therein provided, in the actual occupancy of such persons of African descent shall have the same effect in their behalf as the occupancies of the Choctaw and Chickasaw. So basically, they're in 4th place. Choctaw, Chickasaw get land, the Kansas Indians pick their land, and then the people of African descent would get their land. Last point on this, then I want Judge Joe Brown to see the full picture. Go to Article 4 and type in Negro, Chief Biko. And so what we see here is these are different people according to the Choctaw and Chickasaw government. The person of African descent and the Negro are not the same. And this is the first time that we've been able to recognize this. Even though it's not a United States government document, it's a Choctaw and Chickasaw document, but it says the said nations further agree that all Negroes, not otherwise disqualified or disabled, shall be competent witnesses in all civil and criminal suits and proceedings in the Choctaw and Chickasaw courts. So they can move throughout the court system, these Negroes. Any law to the contrary notwithstanding, and they fully recognize the right of the freedmen, here's a different group of people, to a fair remuneration on reasonable and equitable contracts for their labor, which the law should aid them to enforce. So the freedmen can do contracts, the Negro can operate in the court system. that all the laws shall be equal in their operation upon Choctaws, Chickasaws, and Negroes. Now you got the full picture, not trying to put you in any traps. What's your explanation on the Choctaw and Chickasaw nations recognizing that they got African descent people who were slaves, they got Negroes who can operate in their court systems, and then they got freedmen who can contract and do business?
Okay. See, here's the thing. For the American system, your status as a slave was determined by your mother's status. If your mother was a slave, then you were a slave, unless somebody manumitted you or freed you or emancipated you. What happened when some of these slaves escaped, they married Indian women. The Indian women were not slaves. Therefore, the offspring of this union were not considered slaves. You can see that later with the Seminole Indian scouts, where they looked just like ordinary black folk of the era, but they were integrated into the American army. They bivouacked and slept with the white boys, but they did not get segregated like the Buffalo Soldiers did, because their mothers, being Indian women, were not slave women. Then you had those freedmen who had formerly been slaves, who had been freed, and also the Indian nations decided that they would free their slaves. See, they were separate and apart, and if they lived separate and did not pay taxes, they had their own rules and regulations, and they had their own treaties with the United States, now reunified after the Civil War, and they did not end slavery until sometime in 1866, most of them. So that's why you have this distinction right there. You had those who were looked like everybody else, but their mamas were Indian, so they weren't slaves. Then you had those who were slaves because their mothers were slaves, and they escaped or they had been freed, so they were given rights. And then you had those people who had to be emancipated after the Civil War in the 13th Amendment, which came about in 1866, 1865, late 1865. Not late, finally ratified sufficiently to take effect 1865. So you had these three categories of people that looked alike.
I'm gonna ask a dumb question just for clarification and for those that are listening. So the freedmen, according to the, what is it, the Militia Act of 1755, I believe, that freedman term comes from Europe. So where is
there's an ancient 1,000-year-long history. In Europe, they had serfs, peasants, they had commoners, and then they had landed aristocracy. They were like mafia dons. In fact, there's a direct equivalent between the way the mafia operated in Sicily and then in America with the way feudalism operated. You had the commoners, who were not nobility, but they were possessed of property interest, and at least in England, they were armed regularly. They were the longbowmen that gave the English armies mastery of damn near any battlefield they were involved in. And then you had serfs, and the serfs were below the peasants. The serfs were slaves. They belonged to the land. But they did have a thing in European history that says any serf who escapes and reports into a monastery, a church, and is recorded as having been escaped, if he is still free 1 year and 1 day afterwards, he may report back to the same monastery, same convent, same church, same whatever it may be, and he would be declared free. So there's this concept of freeman that goes back 1,000 years in English history. You have Robin Hood, who was a Saxon lord, and the Normans who came over to England basically enslaved the Saxons. It's interesting that a few hundred years after this happened, the Saxons, who now became the commoners that went over to the New World, they kind of reimposed the whole system that they had been under on the Negroes. And the Negroes were what the Spanish called the people that they had purchased from African representatives to be slaves in the New World, because the Native Americans, the Indians, the Amerins refused to be slaves. They'd starve themselves and die rather than engage in slave activity. It's an interesting way of looking at life compared to what you get brought in as Negroes from Africa. So these things were important. Now,
oh, sorry, go ahead. Go ahead.
But I'm just saying, you have this thing with the concept of the freedman, you have the concept of the emancipated slave, and you have the concept of the person who had been the slave. And then you had the concept of the person who never was a slave because the slave ancestor had escaped, but the individual in question was born to a free woman, an Indian woman, so he never was a slave. So what did you do about him? That's where you get these distinctions in the internal treaties that the Indian nations had amongst themselves and within their Indian nation government.
Great explanation. And what's interesting about this, Judge Joe Brown, is due to reconstructed history, they leave out the European slave.
Like, oh yeah,
you said that's what's interesting is they leave out the peasantry or the serf, as you call them. They just omit all those immigration records of those people being financed and sent over here. And yeah, thank you for breaking that down, because again, we're talking about stuff you're not going to learn in school. So salute to you, Judge Joe Brown, for.
Let me bring something forward on this. Article 1 says every 10 years there shall be a census, the purpose of which is primarily to determine apportionment of representatives in the House, the chamber known as the House in the U.S. Congress. Congress is not the House of Representatives, it's the House and Senate both together. Right. It says for purposes of this apportionment, 3/5 of all persons held in slavery or involuntary servitude shall be counted toward that number. Something you might want somebody to do is look up Samuel Hinckley, Hinkley. Samuel Hinckley was part of this 3/5. But interestingly enough, he had 7 descendants who became U.S. presidents, one who became a U.S. vice president, and one who was a candidate for vice president and governor of Alaska. The governor of Alaska, the vice president, and 3 of the presidents of the United States of America, who were descendants of this Samuel Hinckley, were all alive at the same time. That was George Herbert Walker Bush, president of the United States, George Walker Bush, president of the United States, Barack Obama, who was president of the United States, through his mother. His mother's father, his grandfather on the maternal side, was first cousin to President George Herbert Walker Bush. Both of them were nephews of George Herbert Walker, who founded Halliburton. And Dick Cheney, the vice president, was there, alive at the same time. And when Barack Obama ran for president against John McCain's co-candidate for vice president was Sarah Palin, governor of Alaska, who was also a family member and a niece of George Herbert Walker. So there you have nieces or nephews, Sarah Palin, George Herbert Walker Bush, George Walker Bush, Barack Obama, and you had Dick Cheney, who were all descendants of this Samuel Hinckley, late of Cape Cod, who was part of the 3/5 to be counted toward apportionment of that number.
Great explanation, Judge. I want to get through my section, so I'm going to try to make it a little bit more concise so the other ones can get to their portions. Let's go to Article 43 of this same treaty, where we're going to get into with regard to the Europeans. Since Judge Joe Brown has built on that elaborately, now we're going to make that come alive under Article 43. right? Type in European, or they may call them white. White. Okay. Article 43. The United States promise and agree that no white person, except officers, agents, and employees of the government and of any internal improvement company or persons traveling through or temporarily sojourning in the said nations or either of them shall be permitted to go into said territory. So we can see that they're banning white people in this treaty unless you are an officer traveling through, or you were on some type of you were working for an internal improvement company. So that goes in line with what Judge Joe Brown was just building on, that part of the story when they reconstructed history is they left out the European that was the slave. And so we brought that into the equation tonight as we move forward on this.
Well, there's another category too. This included a significant number. The tribes adopted people.
Correct. That's the next point.
Yeah, and then the next one goes on to teachers, mechanics, or persons skilled in agriculture or other things that might be of help, and it does not prevent the legislative authority of the respective tribes from bringing on board people who have a certain expertise that might be of assistance.
Great catch. You're one step ahead. Great catch. Now, can you do a quick search on this document before we lay this one down? Can you search for the word Civil War on this treaty? All right. Can you type in the word rebellion?
That's 6
Okay.
nations.
All right. So what we want to show the people that are watching this, and that's why we laid down the foundation with the United States Constitution and the Iroquois Confederacy. We know who the real Confederacy government is. It's the people of the land. The people in the United States government's public office also knew that. And with the power of the pen, they tell you there was a civil war, but in writing, they know that their European who rebelled could not create a separate government. You're not going to find the word civil war in any federal act. They're all going to use the word rebellion. That's the last point that I wanted to show on this as we go to the 1887 Dawes Act. And then I'm almost finished with my portion of it. You good, Judge Joe Brown? You good, Judge Joe Brown?
There's a long period of English history involved in this. You had civil war amongst the people who lived in England. You had that way back 1,500 years ago, 1,400 years ago. You had Anglos, well, not Anglos, you had basically the Celts were dealing with what they wound up dealing with the Angles, who were Scandinavian. You dealt with what happened when the Saxons came in. Now they call them Anglo-Saxons, but at one time they were blood feuding, deadly enemies. You had a situation where you had lots of people killing each other for all kinds of reasons. And interestingly enough, they get over it and they start being unified. So you had this tradition of civil wars involved where people who live in the same area are fighting each other. You had one that happened when the Normans came in. And if you've ever watched this series, Vikings, you get into that, where the Norsemen come down and they invade France, and then they put the Norsemen in Normandy, Northman's land. And then the Normans come over to England and whip the behinds of the Saxons. And then that's a civil war when William the Conqueror comes in 1066 and he conquers England. Then you have the thing that leads up to Well, King John got very many rebellions against him, and the Magna Carta gets signed as a result of what amounts to civil war. And then you fast forward to the Wars of the Roses, and you get a kingdom for a horse that is celebrated in Shakespeare. When you get the royal houses and the alliances having a civil war, and then you get another one with Oliver Cromwell, who winds up becoming the Lord Protector of England after they have a civil war that deposes the King of England, and then the Restoration, and this goes on. So you have civil wars all over the place. What happened in Russia during World War I? You get a civil war that winds up with the Soviet Union being established when the communists come in and take over from Tsarist Russia. You get a civil war in China when Chiang Kai-shek is thrown out and Mao Zedong imposes what he does on China. You get a civil war going when Fidel Castro throws Batista out of Cuba.
Gotcha.
You have the Civil War with what happens in the U.S. between 1861 and 1865. Interestingly, I'll touch on this briefly. I don't know if it's going to be relevant, but prior to the American Civil War, when you said United States of America, you took it as a plural. The language would be the United States of America are entering into a treaty with France. After the Civil War, it became a singularity, which we still operate on today. The United States of America is entering into a treaty with France. So there is an interesting distinction between a clear understanding that you're talking about sovereign nations that are small but become powerful when they unify together, just like the Euro Union is today, with a common money, with a common set of customs, with a common set of trade and free access, and no need for border checkpoints to go from one to the other. The Euro Union is still looked at as separate states, but until the American Civil War, the United States was looked at, the United States were looked at, not was looked at. So this is an important distinction in what happens. So when you have the Civil War, you have here the language in these Indian Native American documents. They called it a rebellion, which is exactly what it is. It is a rebellion against lawful authority, which sometimes, if it wins, becomes the new lawful authority. Correct. If it does not, it's usually characterized as a civil war. But this is a separate sovereign entity, the Choctaw and the Chickasaw. And what's going on with them is, as far as they're concerned, they're looking at a foreign rebellion that did not succeed.
Correct. For those that are listening, hopefully you're appreciating Judge Joe Brown's elaborate breakdown. I want to be a little bit more concise with you, Judge Joe Brown, as I get ready to land my plane on my portion of it for everybody else's concern. But right now, what we've learned is the United States government will use the word treaty, and it's not a treaty. The United States government will also use the word civil war, but there'll be no record of a civil war declared, and they will not even put it in writing. They will use rebellion. I want to land my portion of segregation, which is where we are in this bill. We're talking segregation. We're looking at one segregation that is really never talked about amongst our people. And so the Dawes Act of 1887, if you can be concise, Judge Brown, for those listeners, the Dawes Roll and the Dawes Act, is your family on the Dawes Roll? I think you said you're Choctaw by blood. So does that mean you have a Dawes Roll record that your ancestor is on? Is that how you know 100% that you're Choctaw by blood? Or is it just a
I met my grandmother. She was Choctaw. We talked.
Okay.
And but she's also, at one time, I knew the names, but it's been 70 years ago. Hell, I don't remember, but it was written down somewhere in the family records. And I got taken and enrolled I think when I was 2 and again in 4 years old down at the Choctaw Tribal Council meeting in Mississippi, if I'm not mistaken.
Okay.
But yes.
Can you stop sharing your screen, Chief Biko, momentarily? Just for the viewers that are watching, what we want to do is we want to, because most people, Judge Joe Brown, have no idea when you're mentioning, when we're talking Dawes Roll. So basically, this is a Cherokee by blood Dawes Roll. And so what you're saying is your family is on the Choctaw, correct?
Yes.
All right. So for those that are listening who have never done the genealogy in their family, they don't even know who their family is. They're just going with what they're taught in school, that we all came on a ship packed like sardines. What would you explain to somebody about this role? And my second part of that question is, how can you trace an ancestor back to a Dawes roll that could be Choctaw by blood in your case? So you're Choctaw by blood, how do you get reclassified into a racial classification like Negro, black, color? What would be your explanation of how that happened? How you know your bloodline, but you still end up getting reclassified?
Well, that's a convenience to establish this thing called slavery. As I said, your slave status was determined by your mother's status, not your father's. Technically, if your father was a slave and your mother was a free person, you weren't a slave. But they weren't going to let that happen much. So that becomes the determinative, which gets into a whole lot of why it looks crazy and why the percentage of Negro, colored, or black in you became of importance. There is something else that should be of consideration. Every one of the 11 states that became part of the states in rebellion, known as the American Confederacy, outside of the Indian or the Iroquois Confederacy, every single one of them had laws on the books up until about the early 1930s that said if you had no more than a certain percentage of known colored ancestry, you were entitled by law to a declaration of Caucasian status. Arkansas, Alabama, Mississippi, it was 1/4. Tennessee, it was 1/8. Virginia, 1/8. Louisiana, 1/16. That was because the white guys lost a lot of their heirs in the Civil War, which is a rebellion, and they wanted somebody to inherit their properties so the properties would not escheat to the states, which means go back to the state from which all title flows. Mm-hmm. So they had these rules where you could be declared to be white if you had no more than the requisite colored ancestry. After that, mid-1930s, the laws started saying if you have any known colored ancestry, you will be declared colored for purposes of these statutes. Now, why is this term rebellion important? You've heard this thing about the rebellion January 6th, 1920, 1980? No. 2021, January 6th. The language keeps getting batted around of rebellion. Why is that? Because the Constitution makes an exception as to its rules. It says the writ of habeas corpus, which is a way of enforcing constitutional rights, and through that, the Bill of Rights, and also due process of law as established by the Bill of Rights for the U.S. government and by the 14th Amendment for the state governments. There is a way of defeating that if a rebellion or an invasion is active and is in occurrence. So you see the propagandistic engines of the mainstream media casting what happened January 6th as a rebellion, which it was not, because there was no armed rebellion, there was no civil war, there was no uprising. where there was an exchange of armed hostilities. But they're putting it out, telling a lie long enough and loud enough so the public gets acclimated to thinking of January 6th, 2021 as a rebellion, so they will get used to the idea that when somebody starts trying to abrogate the Bill of Rights and due process of law and engage in what has been termed most recently lawfare, they will be accustomed to it and not blink. But that's why you have this term rebellion rather than civil war, because it is a term of art used in the Constitution itself.
Before I turn the mic over, Judge Joe Brown, if you can just give me a short answer to, did your family have heirs property land through your Choctaw side of the family? Did you have heirs property land in your family?
Yes.
Okay.
Matter of fact, there's a historical Black college and university in Jackson, Tennessee. It's known as Lane College.
That college is on your heirs property.
Yeah, 1/3 of the land the college is built in, my grandmother donated to Lane College. It was interesting. They kept approaching her about buying it, and she said she was not going to give it to any colored because they needed to have engaged in a rebellion themselves and gotten free instead of being slaves, and she was not going to help anybody out of pity. When they put it to her later that they wanted them to be more qualified to be free people and control their own destinies and lives, they asked her again, would she sell it? She says, since you put it that way, I won't sell it, but I'll give it to you. So 1/3 of the land is built on properties that she donated to the institution. My grandfather, who was married to her, became physician for the college. I had a aunt who became head librarian, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. So I do have a connection, and property was donated. There is a lot of land that the tribes owned that some select members of the tribe acquired. So yes,
thank you.
I had a direct ancestor who was ancestor of one of my more recent ancestors who died on that Trail of Tears under the Indian Removal Act mess. And I had ancestral uncle and an ancestral aunt who also died on that thing.
Thank you for my time in this section. Listeners, this section of it, if you didn't learn anything else, do your genealogy. Your family may be on the Dawes roll. You may be heir to property. And I'm going to turn it over to Chief Quietwater so she can get to the second half of segregation. Thank you, Joe Brown, for that bill. I'll see you on the next side.
One other thing, too, there's a way you can get into it. If you ask them to do it, if you get into Ancestry.com, they can help you research through tax rolls, census records, and ancient records, burial records, your family history. And if you get into AncestryDNA.com, they can tell you where you came from if you ask them to get into it, when they came from, what your migratory patterns were, what your African ancestry was about, whether you had any ancestors in Spain, Portugal, Germany, Russia, the Netherlands, Sweden, Denmark, Irish, Scotch, or whatever it is, Italy, they can tell you.
Great.
And interestingly enough, I'll tell you another thing that is surprising a lot of Black Americans. They are finding that they have very recent Chinese ancestry.
Chinese. Well, that makes sense because west of the Mississippi River, you had Angel Island, which was the immigration path for people coming from Asia. That makes sense.
No, more recently than that.
Okay.
After the rebellion, the Southern Railway network was a shambles. They brought in all of these coolies from China in the late 1865s, and there was no Chinese nookie, so they got freed slave nookie.
Okay. Out of respect, I'm going to pick back up with you in the 1968 portion, but I'm going to let Chief Quietwater do her bill real quick. Y'all give me about 3 minutes. Thank you, Judge Joe Brown. I'll be right back.
Okay.